Very good morning. If we're all gathered, then let's begin. First of all, welcome, and thank you everyone for joining today's PRCA Business Development Group webinar. I think during these unprecedented times, the need to innovate and really think about how we are engaging with our audiences, with our clients, is more important than ever. And it's with that in mind that we present today's webinar. Shayoni Lynn is the founder of Lynn PR. She is one of the PRCA's newest fellows and one of the UK's leading experts in behavioural science in communication. So we're delighted that she's able to join us today to share some of her insights into the discipline. Just a couple of housekeeping points before Shayoni kicks off. As you'll probably noticed, just myself and Shayoni have our microphones and videos working currently. So if any of our audience are indeed still in their pajamas, then there'll be no judgment, certainly from our end. We warmly invite comment, observations in the chat box on the right-hand side there. And if any of our audience has any questions, then please feel free to post those as Shayoni does her presentation. Shayoni will then endeavour to answer as many of those questions at the end of her presentation as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand the microphone over to Shayoni. Shayoni, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Welcome, everyone. Really pleased to be here and discuss my favorite topic of all time, which is behavioral science. As Charlie mentioned, my name is Shayoni Lynn. I'm founder of Lynn PR. I'm chair of PRCA Cymru, one of the newest fellows, and also PRCA council member. With my CIPR hat on as well, dare I mention it. I'm a CIPR fellow and I'm a founding member and vice chair of CIPR's Behavioural Insights Interest Group. And today I'm here to talk to you about all things behavioral science, audiences, understanding decision-making, etc., etc. My computer's suffering from lag, so I'm going to switch off my video as I present these slides to you. I'll pop my video back on at the end. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll look to answer them at the end of this session. Hang on, there we go. I'll just try and turn this off. Perfect. Right, I'm going to try and, everything is slow on my computer today. So Lynn PR, we provide strategic communications with a behavioral approach. We're an award-winning, full-service, data-driven strategic communications and behavioral insights consultancy. And what we do is we create meaningful campaigns that work, ensuring the audiences pay attention, that they engage with content and messages, and importantly, that they take action. Our recommendations are data-driven, our strategies are informed by insights, and our campaigns are measurable. So why are behavioral insights important? Very simply put, they help us understand and unlock how people make decisions. It provides a much deeper understanding about decision-making, and a behavioral approach to communications can help your audiences adopt more positive behaviors, therefore improving their lives. It's all about understanding the user in their local environment. So at Lynn PR, we apply behavioral science, behavioral economics, nudge theory to a client's context, alongside a robust application of data-driven strategic marketing and communications to strengthen content, to increase visibility of calls to action, and to encourage, there's a typo in there, encourage audiences to take action and adopt positive behaviors. Completely incorrectly written sentence. Never mind. Thinking about audiences, the first port of call is to really understand them. Understanding audiences is critical to effective communications. It is important that we use insight to understand who they are, how they will reach a desired outcome, and what barriers exist that might stop your audiences from reaching those desired outcomes. By finding out more about your audience's attitudes, their habits, and their preferences, we can ensure that communications remain relevant, meaningful, and as effective as possible. Defining, identifying, and mapping audiences helps us understand them. A strategic approach to audiences helps assess current levels of relationships and what they mean to us. And identifying priority audience groups or stakeholders can help clarify who can positively or negatively impact our organization and its reputation. A combination of audience insight and strategic thinking helps build constructive relationships. And it can help turn critics into advocates. It can certainly ensure that the right message reaches the right individual at the right time. And it can boost our communications program to deliver outcomes with organizational impact. But we need to understand audience behaviors if we are to connect with them in meaningful ways. And this is not always about what they do, such as their engagement with our social feeds or even their responses to our calls to action. It's also about understanding the unconscious motivations and biases that exist in all of us as a species, and the opportunities and challenges that these present, especially to us as communicators. And the more we understand how our audiences consciously and unconsciously behave, the choices they make, the way they perceive content and communications, the better we'll be able to design environments where our audiences can thrive. You may know this gentleman. His name is David Halpern. He's the chief exec of the Behavioural Insights team, also known as the Nudge Unit. And he said, do we stumble blindly or do we seek to understand these influences and choices? This is usually when I do this talk, I'm in a room full of people, I can see people raise hands, etc. This is a tad unusual in that I can't see any of you, but I can guarantee that everybody here today, even though I can't see you, has either been an accidental nudger or that you've been nudged yourselves. I'm going to describe a few scenarios and you can reflect whether you've been in that position or not. Fair warning, these are all pre-COVID examples, take you back to the times before this pandemic. If you feel this has happened to you, any of these scenarios, feel free to pop a comment in the chat or just self-reflect. So scenario one, you've met someone for the first time, and it could be for a business or a personal reason. We're in a business development group, so I'm assuming for business reasons. You're in a pub or bar, and they buy the first round, so you feel inclined to buy the next. You're at a train station or airport. Your fellow passenger taps you on the shoulder and asks if you could please keep an eye on their bags whilst they pop to the loo. Normally, you wouldn't notice, but now you're extra vigilant. And scenario three, you're visiting someplace new, you're looking for a nice restaurant to dine at, you're walking along this beautiful street, you stumble across this lovely little bistro, love the look of it, love the menu, but you know what, you want to be 100% sure, right? So you quickly Google them to see their TripAdvisor rating. And you realize that they're not in the top 10, they're quite poorly ranked. So instead, you choose a restaurant from that top 10 TripAdvisor list. So if any or all of those scenarios seem familiar, that's because we nudge and are nudged on a daily basis. That's how our brains are wired, and we don't even pause to notice it. As a human race, we've been nudging each other for as long as we've existed. We are constantly persuading and influencing those around us. However, when it comes to programs and policy, we prefer to view our world through a rational, a logical lens. We focus too much on efficiency and not enough on creativity. But the reality is that as a species, we have both conscious and unconscious motivations. There are lots of things that we do decisively, like fill out a form or compare the merits of two products for overall value. And there are lots of things that we also do instinctively, like detect that one object is further away from the other, depth perception, or understand sentences in the languages that we speak. So I'm speaking to you right now, and I'm hoping that you're not having to exert a lot of mental acumen to try and understand what I'm saying. So if that's the case, then why do we have this need to be logical? And the simple answer is that you can never be fired for being logical. If you use traditional economic theory to propose solutions, and economic theory views life through a very narrow lens, a very rigid lens of what should be versus what is. And if your solutions then don't work, the likelihood is that your senior execs will understand and shrug it off. You probably won't attract much blame. However, the opposite of a good idea can also be a good idea, said Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy. Narrow conventional logic is the natural mode of thinking, but the problem with that is it will get you to the same place as your competitors. And testing counterintuitive solutions and catering for irrationality can take you on a real journey with your audiences. For example, did you know that just by flipping the order of a list, it may make people behave in a completely different way? Or what if I told you that in my previous job as head of communications at Cardiff University, when given the option, our alumni, our graduates, one of the most engaged group of graduates in the UK, preferred to give us their email address via a letter in the post. Sounds absolutely illogical and bonkers. But we knew that because we tested it. And we had the highest engagement rate in the alumni relations sector in the UK. Here's another example. If you were to be in a room full of executives and you were trying to come up with a new soft drink brand that would compete directly with Coca-Cola, how might you advise them? You'd probably say, if we need to compete with Coke, well, then we need the new drink to be tasty, possibly tastier than Coca-Cola, more competitively priced than Coca-Cola, and packaged in a way that looks like it's value for money, right? Now, what if I told you a brand did the exact opposite of those things and managed to give Coca-Cola stiff competition? The drink tasted, and this is a direct quote from the market research report, kind of disgusting. It came in a tiny can and it was exorbitantly expensive for what it was. I'm sure you can probably guess the brand I'm talking about. It's Red Bull. And it's a really good example of what happens when you embrace irrationality. The case study of Red Bull is now studied globally by psychologists and behavioral scientists because what they did so well. I'm sure many of you have read this book. There's a lot of confusion about what nudge theory is. So I'm here to deconstruct some of that. Nudge theory is a subset of behavioral science and really is a suite of tactics to enable better decision-making within audiences by improving their user journeys and environments and presenting choices in a more streamlined, easier to access format. So what is a nudge? It's all about opening the door to creating alternative creative options which can be more effective. Nudge approaches avoid closing down choices. They create an environment where we can guide or encourage audience behavior, but it's important to note it is without mandating, without forcing, or without instructing. Nudge theory pulls from three strands of research. There's experimental psychology, which has implications for design and pricing, social psychology, and this is how others influence our actions and our choices, and cognitive psychology, which is all about our internal thought processes and the mental shortcuts that we use in our decision-making every day. Nudge is all about introducing a realistic model of human behavior into communications programs. Nudge-type approaches could achieve better outcomes at a lower cost and with greater respect for personal choice. As human beings and as people, we are busy and we have limited attention. Our brains are ceaselessly inferring, overlaying, and interpreting new information and memories all the time. And a lot of our decision-making, therefore, is based on inference. And sometimes we get this wrong. And therefore, as human beings, we are nudgeable. So how can nudge theory and wider behavioral science principles be used in communications? Well, it can be used to start or adopt a new behavior. It can be used to stop a damaging behavior. It can be used to prevent the adoption of a negative or harmful behavior, or it can be used to change or modify an existing behavior. I've got a couple of slides just on sort of a communications campaigns approach. This is the Government Communications Service GCS guide called Strategic Communications, a Behavioural Approach. You may or may not have seen it, but it outlines how to adopt behavioural science into communications and campaigns. And of course, it starts with objective setting. It's important to set out what the activity is and what it is intending to achieve, and analyze what the behavioural aspect to that objective is. Needless to say, objectives should be smart and focused on outcomes and not outputs, and related to changing attitudes and/or behavior. Next, we must ask, what do we want people to do? Do we want people to respond to surveys, sign up to activities, attend events? Do we want people to eat healthy, smoke and drink less, exercise more? What do we want them to do, and what are the behavioral aspects to these actions? Once we've identified our desired behaviors, then we need to start by identifying the barriers to those behaviors. unless we know what could be stopping people from doing certain things, we won't be able to design interventions or solutions that change their behavior. And you might ask, well, how do you then go about diagnosing these barriers? There's 1,000,001 frameworks in behavioral science for everything that we can think of. But one of the most common diagnostic frameworks that exist is called the COMBI model. You may, again, have heard of it by Susan Mickey in UCL. And the COMBI model states that either one or more of these aspects affect behavior: capability, opportunity, and motivation. So thinking about capability, does your target audience have the right skills, the right knowledge? Have they the right physical and mental ability to carry out the behavior that you want them to do? Do they know how to do what you're asking them to do? Thinking about opportunity, does your target audience have the resources to undertake that behavior? Have they the right systems, the right process, and the right environment around them that support that behavior? Have the people around them who will either help or hinder them in carrying out that behavior? A motivation, where we focus a lot of our energy, but from experience, if you can sort out capability and opportunity, motivation follows. Thinking about motivation, does your target audience want to carry out the behavior? Do they believe that they should? And have they the right habits in place to do so? So I'm going to quickly take you through a case study and take a sip of my coffee. This is one of our most recent campaigns that we did during the first lockdown for NHS in Southeast London. It's a mental health campaign called Free Your Mind. So as we remember very freshly, availability bias there, it's a mental heuristic. The COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown has presented the NHS with a number of challenges. And obviously one of the biggest one was the impact of safety measures and behaviors on mental health, still an existing worry. Our client recognized the risk of rising mental ill health early on and wanted to raise awareness of and engagement with its mental health services and well-being resources. We were briefed to help raise awareness of and engagement with these mental health services. We needed to educate and engage vulnerable and seldom heard audience groups, as well as the wider residents in Southeast London, and help them get to the services that they needed during this lockdown. Those were our targets. We had KPIs against each of those, and we had 12 weeks to research and approach, develop and activate a campaign. And those were our KPIs. So we used a combination of tactics to make our objectives measurable. We looked at social media advertising estimations, we looked at industry benchmarks, we looked at proxy data, and we transformed those non-smart business objectives into measurable communications objectives. And we also identified two behavioral objectives. The first one was to ensure that residents would visit the campaign microsite when they felt mentally unwell. And the second one was to discuss that residents would discuss any mental health issues with a trusted individual. Once we established those measurable objectives, we segmented our audiences to ensure that content was relevant and meaningful to each of these groups. Our approach was to understand the problem with a behavioral lens, helping identify the target behaviors and providing insights on influences that drove audience decision-making. We always undertake behavioral diagnostics to understand specific barriers to decision-making and what stops people from taking action in that particular context. And as much as we reflect on capability, opportunity, and motivation, we also reflect on cognitive biases that might be impacting action and decision-making. And these were some of the biases and barriers that we discovered during this phase. We use the data and behavioral insights to develop a series of key messages to tackle each of those barriers. Key messages for this mental health Free Your Mind campaign were: can you spot the signs of mental ill health? Don't ignore your mental health. Talking is important, so is listening. Who would you call to discuss your mental health? And what is mental health? These sound really simple, but there were specific behaviors we wanted to encourage, and we wouldn't have gotten to these key messages had we not conducted a behavioral diagnostic. We developed a strategy for platform awareness campaign that would simplify the user journey and create a more effective choice architecture. Choice architecture is the decision-making environment for our audiences. And we created a microsite, we created behaviorally informed content that we tested. We had a social strategy that was cost-effective and was developed to target audiences on quite a granular level. And then we worked with our clients' partners to ensure that we're driving traffic to correct resources. This is, I'm not going to go into detail, but this was sort of the campaign creative platform. The most common theme, or the most important theme rather, we identified at the due to our behavioral insights work was that individuals did not know what good or poor mental health looked like. So they were unable to tell when they were suffering from mental ill health. So this behavioral insights learning informed the ideation of Free Your Mind, and we developed this campaign slogan, "Can you spot signs of mental ill health?" which was received really, really well during test phase. And then we always test our behavioral hypotheses. We come in completely with no subjective opinion. We're happy to be proven wrong. So in this particular case, we tested for a 2-week period, targeting residents on quite a granular level. We ran these as randomized online trials. We repeated certain trials when we didn't get statistically significant outcomes. And this is sort of the campaign activation. You can see we had a microsite. We had social paid advertising on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. We did a little bit on search and then also Twitter. So what? This is what I ask myself and my team for every single campaign or every single project that we deliver. So what? So what happened as a result of this activity? What value or tangible results did we deliver? So that's our results on a page. We reached over 1.4 million residents of a 1.9 million population, where our KPI was between 728,000 and 2 million. And that led to over 5 million impressions. We had a 2.3% engagement rate, which was 3 times higher than the industry average, with our KPI of 1.05%. And on channels like Facebook and Instagram, where we focused a lot for attention, our engagement rate there was 3.7%, which was 4.5 times higher than industry average. 54% of our engagements were with key calls to action. We drove over 20,000 unique website visits, well over our KPI. And importantly, we generated 44% engagement from BAME residents of a mean population of 39% BAME. In terms of action, as I said, over 25,000 link clicks, well above our KPI, 25% clicked on a partner link, and very importantly, we drove 766 new registrations for partner services. We also had hundreds of residents who saved our post, and we had returning visits to our microsite. We also had hundreds of residents who accessed some very key calls to action, such as getting emergency help if they were feeling really unwell. This campaign, obviously, we were able to rise above a very saturated environment. Mental health is a very saturated space to run communications in. There's a lot of content out there, but we were able to rise above that saturation and create really salient, really meaningful conversations around mental ill health, and engaged with residents and often seldom heard groups like BAME and children and young people, and at speed. And this was a UK Social Media Awards finalist as well. So this shows sort of a behavioural approach to strategic communications, how it can deliver the brief, not just deliver the brief, but go above and beyond delivering the brief and really create tangible, meaningful results for clients that deliver intrinsic human value. Any questions? I'm gonna turn back my camera if I can. There we go.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that insightful talk, Shayoni. We've got a couple of questions to kick off with from Andy Turner. Thank you very much indeed for sharing those, Andy. Let's start with this one. It's a great question. The UK has been a global pioneer in behavioural science. So why hasn't this been more successfully deployed by government in getting people to do the right things during the current COVID crisis?
What a lovely question. We have been a pioneer in behavioural science. Our nudge unit was one of the first nudge units set up, and there are more than 200 nudge units now globally, helping governments with policy making. Why hasn't this been adopted more globally? I think there is firstly this perhaps misconception that it could be propaganda and it could be a way of manipulating behaviors when it isn't. It can be used for evil, like any science, and we have seen it used for very evil purposes in manipulating elections and manipulating referendums, but it shouldn't, and that's not why this science was created. I think another reasons why it's not more globally, more universally adopted within this country is there's a disconnect between the academic frameworks and the communications practices. As communicators, we are very creative. We like to go with our instinct, and we're always working to a brief that has to be delivered yesterday. So pausing and taking stock of where we are, doing the research and the due diligence, bringing in that academic rigor sometimes is an extra step too much. And in behavioral science, we would call that friction. But the importance of applying that approach is obviously, we've seen it used here in the pandemic, and we've seen how quickly as a population we've adopted very alien habits, very alien behaviors. 6 months ago, you told, not 6 months, maybe last year, if you told a behavioral scientist that you could get most of the Western world wearing a mask, we would be laughing. But we've seen how used effectively, used properly, it can drive really change behaviors, change habits, but it has to be adopted in the right way for it to be effective. Does that answer your question?
Great, thank you for that, Shayoni. And we'll move on to another question now from Andy. This one comes down to that great almost dichotomy in our industry of the difference between, I think, what people say and what they actually do. So Andy's question is: PR is a huge user of surveys, and yet we now know that asking people what they do and why is scientifically flawed. So Shayoni, what is your advice for anyone who thinks consumer surveys are valid, and how do we discover what people really do instead of what they say they do?
Andy, you have the best questions today. I love it. Yes, at Lynn PR, we treat survey with a massive dollop of salt. What we say when what our intent and our action are often two different things. And equally, it depends on how the survey was conducted, so the context of that survey, whether we were asked to identify ourselves. So when surveys require us to provide our own name, our own details, we provide answers unconsciously that we think the survey conductor wants to hear. So it may, it's not often something we do consciously. It's just because we've identified and we feel the pressure of representing ourselves. So we've seen how surveys can be wrong in all of the elections that have recently happened, exit polling. The way we approach, we look at actual behavior. We don't look at intent. There will be an element of looking at intent if we're doing behaviorally informed surveys, but then we map that back to actual action. So we're right now in the midst of doing a randomized controlled trial in London, where we will be looking at actual action to specific ask, as opposed to asking people whether they're likely to take that action or not.
Thank you. What about neuroscience, Shayoni? Is that something that's been used in your campaigns? This is a question from Nikki. It's been widely used in the ad industry, but not so much in the PR industry. So your thoughts on neuroscience, please.
I think they all fall into the sort of spectrum of behavioral science and has influenced a lot of the literature that is available now. I think the ad industry and marketing has probably used behavioral science principles a bit more effectively than communications. Whether the breadth of knowledge is there. I'm not sure. I think whatever you use, the key thing is being academic and robust. The key thing is not to give into pop psychology, non-peer reviewed, non-replicable studies, or things based off a book which purports to know X, Y, and Z, but there's no actual evidence base to really reflect on that. A great example of how studies are really important to be peer reviewed and replicated. In behavioral science, we have a huge replication crisis, and that's because behavior happens within context. So what might happen in a lab context may not necessarily happen in a real world context. Can't speak anymore, and certainly may not even happen multiple times within that context. So the authors of Nudge, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, are rewriting their book because some of their studies didn't replicate. So it just goes to show there's nothing wrong in sort of going back and saying that didn't work, let's try something else. But whether it's neuroscience, behavioral economics, please look at the literature, look at the right literature.
Thank you. A question from Matt. Setting KPIs can be quite challenging. What do you use to find industry averages or other benchmarks, such as those in the hashtag Free Your Mind campaign?
Yeah, KPIs are tough. So we do always do a piece of research to understand what existing campaigns. So if we don't have data from a similar campaign, going back, we look at proxy data. So that's what we did for Free Your Mind. We looked at mental health campaigns. We looked at health campaigns. We tried to set KPIs based on those metrics, but the government communication service model does share how to set measurable objectives, and it's based on things like baseline, change, justification. So where are you now? Where do you want to get to, and what's your research rationale to where you want to get to, and how are you able to sort of convince or convey that objective within the context of what you're trying to achieve. So there are ways of setting measurable communications objectives, even in the face of non-measurable business objectives. Okay.
Thank you. Where do you recommend starting when it comes to learning more about behavioural psychology?
Ooh, very good question. There's a lot of literature out there. Obviously, psychology is one of the cornerstones of behavioral science, and it's been influenced then by economics and a lot of other fields as well. I would probably say, if you're looking from a psychological perspective, probably the best book to start with is Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. It's something he wrote in the 80s, and it was actually written to sort of warn consumers about the tricks played by car salesmen, by fundraisers, all these manipulations, and I think, what do you call it? Some weapons of influence is what he used to call it in that book, and how they would use these tactics to get people to buy more or buy the right product. But obviously, when he wrote that, he had huge interest from marketeers, and he's updated the book several times. But that's a really good starting point in behavioral psychology. You've got a copy. There we go. Perfect. What do you think of the book, Charlie? Oh, you're on mute.
Fantastic, very insightful. Thoroughly recommended reading for everyone interested in the discipline.
Yeah, I think Cialdini, he's written loads of other books. There's another one called Persuasion, but it's he's probably top of the game behavioral psychologist. On mute.
A question now from Simon. In your mental health example, it would be good to understand a bit more about how you went about identifying the audiences, segmenting barriers and behaviours, etc. Did you use particular data tools or do surveys to understand your audience a bit more before doing the campaign? And when you respond to a brief, could you break down in terms of percentage the time you spend looking at your audience versus creative and tactics?
So I'm going to start with the last one. No, we don't, because Lympia is built on research and behavioral insights. So when people come to us, they come to us for that knowledge. So far, we're still young and things might change. But so far, when clients come to us, they know that we prioritize research and behavioral insights. And we only go into the creative process once we've done our due diligence with a behavioral hypothesis. And then we even when we test, we create multiple variants because we don't want to be biased in how we feel the audience might react to some of our content creators and calls to action. With Free Your Mind, a lot of our segmentation was based off client need. So we knew there were specific pockets of people who weren't perhaps engaging with the mental health services, who might be at, might be potentially at crisis or might be ignoring a crisis. We also knew there were particular groups of people that our client needed to attract to new services, such as new apps, etc. So they needed a focus there. Really reflecting on Free Your Mind, I think it was still quite an introductory segmentation. And it could be much deeper. The insights we collected of that initial spectrum of audiences that we listed out was very deep, very data driven, and they influence the ongoing campaigns that we do for our clients. So we're working right now on FluVac, and those insights, knowing which particular group uses what channel at what time and what kind of message gets them to click on a button or engage with the comment, that has been really helpful in us using those insights for the flu vaccination campaign. I was going to say something else on segmentation. Another key thing that we found was it was not just the audiences themselves, it's about attracting their reference network, their influences, and really being able to connect not just to your core audience, but to the people who help them make decisions.
Great, thank you. A question here. Typically, I probably, with many, most others, associate the application of behavioural science and data with expensive. That's obviously for the big consumer brands with huge budgets. But what aspects of this can realistically be applied in the B2B space, i.e. tech, professional services, etc., or for smaller, less wealthy brands?
Application of behavioral science is not expensive. That's just a way. In behavioral science terms, that's costly signaling. No, it's not expensive at all. Science is the way to do it. Change behavioral insights is the outcome. So there's no reason for it to be expensive. There's a lot of expense that goes into just normal campaigns, in creatives, in delivery on channels that may not be the channels that your users consume. It's just about optimizing budget to ensure that what you're delivering is actually working. And that's where the testing is really important. So every time you test, you know what works, what doesn't before you scale up. So whether B2B, whether less wealthy brands, a proper use of behavioral science and application of behavioral science is not an expensive affair.
Thank you. Just to mention as well that Shayoni and Lynn PR are bringing out a newsletter. So if any of our audience would be keen to, receive further insights regularly on an ongoing basis, then please do share your email address in the chat box below, and you get some great insights there landing regularly in your inbox. I had a quick question actually, Shayoni, if that's okay. Something you briefly touched on in the previous question, but I was just wondering if there are any business sectors in particular that you think could really benefit from a behavioural science focused approach.
Good question. I mean, I would say every sector, but I think in the current climate that we're operating in, obviously public health, retail, potentially, and retail does that very well, so that's really not a problem there. Health tech, fintech, but any sector really, because as it's about connecting with your audiences in a meaningful way, and every single sector connects with their audience in some way or the other. So it doesn't really matter which sector you are. It's about a way of thinking and a way of applying communications, which is beyond the client likes it and the agency likes it, to your audience really connects with it.
Thank you. How do you test campaigns before they go live? I just wonder if we could have a bit more on the the tools that you use, surveys, focus groups, etc.
Yeah, so we do a lot of different types of testing. The key to testing is ensuring they're randomized and that they're sanitized. So the variables that we are testing we can report back, and it's always ensuring that the outcome that we get is statistically significant. So sometimes when there's a, it's not, the margin isn't as high as, as I would like, we would then rerun a test. Tools we use for online testing, we use social media, which is a very cost-effective way of testing. We also run offline testing, as we are doing currently with one of our clients with a randomized control trial, which is a much bigger type of test where we are using text messaging. We also sometimes conduct surveys, but they're behaviorally informed surveys to either confirm or amend our hypotheses. We tend to usually do that for research projects. And for that, use any survey mechanism. We use Typeform. Again, going back to the question, it doesn't have to be expensive. It's about how you deliver it.
Great, thank you. Another question from me is just really about where you see the future of behavioural science lying. What are the challenges? And I guess as well, how do we safeguard to ensure that behavioural science is a discipline that is always used for good?
That's a really deep question, and it's something I think as a sector, and not as a PR sector, as a behavioural science sector and community, we're trying to address. Ethics is a big part of ethics is a big part of how we apply, and ultimately we are the ones responsible. So like all science, as I said, it can be used for good or for bad. It's up to us as practitioners to ensure that we are using it for the right reasons, and we do need some sort of code of conduct, some sort of ethical guidance to ensure we're being held accountable to how we are applying it. It's the same problem that we face in communications and ethics. PRC does great work in holding agencies to account and holding practitioners to account, and we need something similar in the behavioral science world, and I know that we are developing that. It's not yet just been released. So yeah, I think it's important to safeguard the practice. I think there's a huge need for literacy. There's a lot of people who claim to use behavioral science techniques who might actually be using a rehashed nudge and influence tactics. And the problem with that was it's great to start somewhere. If that is being sold as behavioral science, and if it's not being applied in the right way, it will not provide the results that a proper behavioral science methodology will, and therefore creates a bad impression of the science with clients and with organizations. So it's really important that if someone raises the hand to say they work in behavioral science, that they're very clear about their literacy, and they, like with communications, upscale, learn, invest in CPD, and ensure that they are always using best practice.
Thank you. And how do you incentivize people to actually do your surveys and engage in the testing process? If you're doing it yourself?
The answer is we don't. That's the beauty of behavioral science, is the content should be appealing enough for people to want to engage with it. And that's how it's all down to framing. It's down to the channel, the time, the context, and having different variants to test so you can tell which particular message was more resonant than others. We do not incentivize. We do not incentivize our testing. We sometimes incentivize campaigns. I think we've only done that a couple of times, really, where we've said this is a really tough ask. In order to make it more salient and more attractive, can we use something like a price draw? But that is not something that we go with in terms of testing. So if anything, when we test, we try and, so this current campaign we're working on, where we're working on a very legislative consultation piece for the client, and it's really quite dry. So where we did recommend incentivizing the behavior with a price draw. However, when we tested it, we ensured that there was no messaging in the testing around that incentivization. So we wanted to keep that quite sanitized to understand what works and what doesn't. So in the first test, in the second test, we did put it in, and we had various different variants of attracting people via that price draw. But we could see that whilst content around the price draw was attractive, content that did not include the price draw was also attractive. So this is sort of the methodology of using behavioral science.
Great, thank you. And a further question from Matt. How do you stay current and up to date on the latest methodologies, studies, and advances in behavioral sciences? Are there any particular newsletters, sites, podcasts, other resources that you would recommend?
There are so many resources. How do I stay current? I'm in the community, so I'm very engaged with the community, like I am with communication. So it is about being active and proactive and finding those networks and being there. Also following behavioral science leaders and engaging with them, engaging with their content. I'm very proud to say 2 very big behavioral scientists follow me on Twitter. One that followed me today and made my day, Wendy Wood. You may or may not know her. She's the queen of habits. I do recommend giving her a follow, but she followed me today, made my day. And Cass Sunstein, who's the author of Nudge. We also converse. So yeah, it's about investing in that piece as much as you invest in communications. You know, it's about ensuring that you're reading the latest literature, finding out what books are coming, thinking wide outside of behavioral science, thinking about service design, user journeys, thinking about how messages are framed. You know, the whole piece, as opposed to just quite narrowly looking at something like Nudge.
Thank you very much. I think if there are no further questions, we'll leave it there. Just to say thank you very much indeed to our audience for participating today. And thank you indeed to Shayoni for sharing her insights.
Absolute pleasure.
I think it's been an absolutely fascinating session. So thank you very much. I think the main takeaway from it really is that I think in the communications industry, working pure on instinct is something that that perhaps has been a regular facet of the way that the work has been done. I think the application of behavioural science can really elevate the art of communications to the next level, going beyond instinct to testing to actually prove that your hypothesis works. I think that's what it comes down to. So thank you very much once again, Shayoni. It just leaves me to wish everyone. Thank you. To wish everyone.
Thank you for having me. And again, if you want to be on the Lynn PR newsletter soon to launch, which promises to deliver behavioral science and communications content, please either pop your email here or drop me a message or Charles a message. That'd be great.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And just wishing everyone a very successful end to the year. Hopefully a Merry Christmas as well. Thank you very much indeed.